Welcome to Dairy Australia's Victorian Service Provider Update. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listening to our webinar. I know we're all in uncharted waters at the moment and adjusting to this new normal. My name's Libby Hurd and I'm a Regional Extension Officer with Gibbs Dairy. Today we'd like to take the opportunity to give you an update on how COVID-19 is impacting the dairy industry and what tools and information is available to you as service providers to assist farmers in protecting their farm, their team and their business. We'd also like to present our biannual update on situation and outlook for the dairy markets. So just a little bit of housekeeping today. We've done today a little bit different, being on a webinar just due to the large numbers that we've got. You'll notice that you're all on mute and that you can only see and hear the presenters, including John Droppert sitting in his tractor, which is one of the best sound rooms we could have. So due to the size of today's group, we won't be enabling attendees to talk for the questions and I'll facilitate them for you. The session's being recorded and will be available early next week for anyone who's missed it. There'll be a Q&A session at the end of each of the presentations and would really like you to contribute any questions at all. So you can either pop your questions up onto the Q&A tab button that you can see up the top, or you can text them through to me on 0407 595187 and I'll be asking those questions at the end of each presentation. There's also an option in there to wave your hand. Just please probably give that one a miss at the moment just due to managing the group. Alternatively, there's also a chat, but if we can put as many questions into Q&A, that would be great. Thank you. So I'd first like to welcome our first panellist, Dr. John Penry. John is the Technical and Innovation Manager for Dairy Australia. He's one of the leaders of the DA team, and John's going to give you an overview of how COVID-19 is affecting the dairy industry, what Dairy Australia is doing to help farmers during this time, and as service providers, what you can do to assist or find information. So thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Libby, and good morning to everyone who is online and listening and watching. We really appreciate your time, taking time out of what has been a busy period for everyone, I'm sure. I just want to go through a couple of things briefly for you in preparation for the Q&A, and the focus is specifically on resources that have been built for service providers. So I'd like to do this in basically three parts. The first port of call is just to make sure that everyone is aware of the dedicated part of the Dairy Australia website that has been built 3 weeks ago in response to COVID-19. This screenshot here just shows you the homepage for dairyaustralia.com.au, and the red arrow is pointing towards the link that you would push to take you onto the COVID-19 landing page. Next one, please, Libby. So this is an image of the landing page for the COVID-19 part of the website. The website has been rebuilt twice already since it was first put up to try and improve navigation for anyone who is looking at it. You'll note that up on the top part in the middle of the screen, you'll see 3 logos. Now, this is really to highlight the fact that whatever has been built under the direction, if you like, of both Australian dairy farmers, the Australian Dairy Products Federation and Dairy Australia. So there is a group sitting within all 3 of these organisations, shared between these organisations, which is really trying to coordinate the response on behalf of the dairy industry, and that is across all of the supply chain. So from farm all the way through to the processors, to make sure that our industry is impacted as little as possible in terms of people getting sick from this virus. The red section on the left-hand side, we've just put a red box to highlight the navigation pane here. So what we're looking at is the landing page, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other pages attached to this website. And the one that we're mostly going to be focusing on is the information for processors and service providers. Next one, please, Libby. Okay, so it just shows you the directory here. The approach that we've taken for building things on the web is that for aspects of the response that we know are going to change, particularly as it relates to the regulations and laws governing workplace safety, and also how farms can operate underneath their industrial relations obligations. Those parts of the website have been left deliberately as primarily text on web pages. Where we know that the information is not going to change as much, we have built fact sheets. And the decision has been made that whatever materials are produced in the resources, we are trying to have those go out via as many channels as possible. So, for example, the first place that any new resource will land is on the website. But then beyond that, we are looking at, in many cases, producing those also as podcasts, as video casts, as pieces which go up on social media, and any other means that we think will be required and important. So it really has been a shotgun approach, for want of a better word, to try and make sure that the technical messages which we are trying to get out can go as far and as wide via as many channels as possible. So we'll go to the next one, please. One of the things which happened relatively early on in the piece, about 2 weeks ago, is a service provision, essential services for the dairy sector was built. So what we're doing here is we're showing you a list which is available on the website. This list is extensive. You're only seeing part of it here on the right-hand side of the page. It goes for essentially 9 pages. The idea behind this was to try and encapsulate for government, both state and federal, all sections of the dairy industry which should be regarded as essential services. And I would suggest that there would be no one represented on the webinar today whose profession or business type would not appear on this list. So this list was delivered through to the government last week. And what it really tries to reinforce is that all sections of the dairy industry which help to keep farms and processes running are important and should be considered as essential. So that's just to highlight that. If we go to the next one, please. Okay, I just want to run through, for the benefit of the service providers listening in and looking, we really want to underpin that the advice contained in the resources has at its very foundation our current understanding of how this virus works and how the illness associated with it works. To that end, we have convened a farm safety technical panel to help us in this regard, and they have helped to underpin the technical advice which has been delivered through the various resources. So here's a couple of things which inform us about how these resources have been built. And this is really a case of understanding the enemy. So a couple of things which make this new disease really tricky. The first one is that this virus has a very long incubation period compared to, say, SARS, which emerged a couple of years ago, much longer incubation period. And the period, the median period for when you go from first being infected through to first having symptoms, the median of that is 5 days. But the range, based on current information, goes anywhere from 2 to 14 days. So long incubation period. The second one is that we understand from work done overseas is that it is highly likely that the majority of infections are occurring in new cases due to virus shedding from people who are asymptomatic. So it's believed that up to 80% of new infections or new cases have occurred because of transmission from people who were asymptomatic at the time of the transmission. The other thing which is worthy of note is that shedding is not just through aerosols, but shedding of the virus can also occur via virus particles that end up on human skin and can survive quite happily in skin pores, for example. So skin contact with surfaces that are then touched by other people remains one of the means of transmission. And we understand from work that's come out relatively recently is that there is an enormous range of how long the virus can remain viable on surfaces, including plastics and stainless steel. So we do understand that the virus cannot replicate when it's on another surface, but certainly the virus can be transmitted because it stays viable on those surfaces for hours through to days. So here's really the thing that is driving so much of the energy that's happening, not just in the dairy sector, but in the wider economy and society in general. We understand absolutely that the morbidity and the mortality of this virus is far or significantly greater than flu. The other thing that we also understand is that the morbidity and the mortality significantly increases in people who are over 60, in people who have any sort of predisposing illness from respiratory disease, heart disease, through to cancer treatments, for example. And it also has increased in people who are smokers. We also understand that the mortality, not just in other parts of the world, but certainly the Australian statistics show this as well, mortality is increased in males relative to females, particularly in those people over the age of 60. So these are the things which underpin how we assess risk and the information which has been put together to try and reduce that risk, that prevention of spread in farm workplaces and beyond that through up and down the dairy supply chain. The other thing which is also of note here is that given where dairy farms are located around the country, we know and understand that the health services available in rural areas are more limited than what we have in the city areas. And that also underpins the way that we have tried to come out with advice very quickly and advice that's very targeted. So the foundations of all of the advice that is available for both farmers and service providers, the foundations of the control rest on two basic premises. That is the use of physical distance, and in some cases physical distance to the point where people are isolated completely, and the role of sanitisation. Next one, please. I just wanted to show you a couple of the resources available on the website, which I think will be important for you to find and have a look at and really underpin what advice has been put out for service providers. This one here we call the Fast Facts for stopping spread of COVID-19 on farm. This has been available now for about 10 days. It's now in its second iteration. With all of the resources, you will always see a version number and the date at which it was first published up in the top part of the resource. Some of the resources are now up to their third version. This really tries to encapsulate both in words and in pictograms all of the underlying control points that we think need to be considered both in the farm workplace and any other workplace involved with the dairy supply chain. And I'd really urge you to have a look at that. Next one, please. The second one more specifically, which builds on the Fast Facts, is a single fact sheet which is available on the website. It's been there since the 27th of March, so this is version 1 of advice given to both service provider businesses and also farms on how to engage service providers and what sort of things need to be put in place on farm to prevent the spread of COVID-19. One of the things which is really underlined here is how essential is the service that you're thinking of undertaking on farm, and really asking farmers, can you defer the task, or can the task be done in another way that doesn't involve people coming on farm? But in so many cases, people do have to come on farm. And what this fact sheet really tries to underline is how you need to be very careful about how you put in place both physical separation and the idea that disinfecting or sanitising pieces of equipment, particularly things which are used by more than one person, is absolutely pivotal. Next one, please. Okay, so this is just the final thing that I wanted to show to you. And this just gives you a sense of how some of the resources have been distilled down into really basic messages. This is a poster that was built 2 weeks ago. It's now in its second iteration, so it's version 2. And this describes the agreed protocol or the basis for the agreed protocol for milk pickup or milk tanker operators. This has been built in consultation with a reference group for milk tanker operators, representing not just the processors, but also companies who are engaged by processors to do the pickup. And what it tries to show is that for something that we know is an absolutely essential part of the dairy supply chain, which is milk pickup, that there have been some very basic things put in place that have underpinning them physical distance and sanitisation to reduce the risk of COVID transfer, both from anyone on farm to the milk tanker operator and vice versa. So that's all I wanted to show you, but I would really strongly urge everyone, if you haven't had a chance to look through the COVID page on the dairyaustralia.com.au website, I'd really implore you to look at that. There is a significant amount of resource there now. The resource is changing. It's really worthwhile having a look at it each day, even if you only scan it. And any feedback that any of the service providers have on the resources there, we'd be very pleased to have that at any point in time. We do understand that there are supply issues with some commercial disinfectants and with some personal protection equipment, especially disposable gloves. We understand that we haven't got a lot of control over, in fact, we've got very little control over anything in the supply chain, but we certainly do offer alternatives in those resources if those things are not necessarily available. So thanks very much, and Libby, back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in on the Q&A in the chat line. The first one is, are you able to comment on any arrangements that are regarding AI tech support given lockdown arrangements? Many AI techs come from interstate or overseas and are moving around the different regions, and are AI techs considered essential?
So let's do that in a different order. So AI technicians are absolutely considered as essential, and they're absolutely on that list. There was a reasonable amount of communication that happened last week or the week before, specifically around movement of AI technicians across the South Australian border in the southwest of Victoria. We have taken pretty significant steps, so that's the wider industry, to ensure that there is free passage across state borders for people who are providing services onto farm without having the necessary requirement of self-isolation, which other parts of the community have to go through. And there is specific advice on the COVID pages of the website around that. I can't offer any comment for AI technicians coming in from overseas. So, for example, New Zealand, my understanding, and I stand to be corrected here, is that people coming in from New Zealand, irrespective of what their profession was, and irrespective of what industry they were going to work in, they would still have to go through self-isolation for 14 days.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Next questions come in. You mentioned antibacterial spray a number of times, but it will not control the virus. Does this need clarification, as it could evoke overconfidence that they're doing the right thing?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question completely, but I'll try and answer it as best I can. There's a resource that was put up on disinfectants that tries to clarify that if you're using commercial grade or commercial disinfectants, to check that it has viral activity. For situations where that is not available, our understanding is that 70% alcohol is suitable. And our further understanding is that there will be a very significant reduction in viral load on surfaces if they are sanitised with those types of products. If I haven't answered that question as it was posed, please feel free to ask the question again.
Good, thank you. Should vehicles and clothes be washed and changed between farms?
The advice is that where possible, there should only be one person in a vehicle, both on farm, within the farm team, and also for service providers coming on farm. So practically that means that if the agronomist has to visit the farm, then the agronomist can't have any of the farm team in their car, and they can't ride with any of the farm team either. In terms of disinfecting or cleaning down the outside of the vehicle, that is not the current advice, and that's really predicated on the fact that beyond the handles on the doors, there's no other high touch points on the vehicle. So handles on the doors, clean them and sanitise them, but in any other parts of the vehicle, no. Sorry, Libby, what was the other part of the question?
Do they need to be changed between farms?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so clothing, yes. So so because there is evidence that the virus can survive on cloth materials. The advice is that overalls, for example, should be changed between farms, and where possible, any pieces of clothing that are likely to have hand contact, for example, should be washed as well.
Excellent, thanks, John. And one last one is there a list of who is defined as essential services?
Yes, so there is. So the list is sitting on the COVID pages of the website. It's under information for processors and service providers. So that's the specific part of the navigation on the landing page on the left-hand side. And when you go to that page, you will see the list there. It's as a downloadable PDF. And just to reiterate that list, which was agreed to across the industry, both at the processor level, Australian dairy farmers level, and also for Dairy Australia, that list has been provided to both state and federal governments to completely reinforce that all of these businesses across the dairy supply chain are part of essential services that underpin dairy, which is seen as an essential industry.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, John. I think that's most of the questions that we have coming through for now. Hang on a minute, I've just got one more coming through. These questions will be available afterwards, but also if you think of any more questions while John Droppert's speaking, more than welcome to pop them up on the Q&A, and we'll bring John Penry back in again at the end for any other questions if there's anything that's relevant. Okay, now I would just switch the tech over, and I'm going to introduce you to John Droppert. So John is the Industry Insights and Analysis Manager for Dairy Australia. He'll be giving you an update on the Situation and Outlook report that's recently released, but also some insight on how COVID-19 is affecting the global and local market. So welcome to John Droppert. I'll just share my screen.
Thanks very much, Libby, and thanks everyone for tuning in the circumstances. It's I'm not quite sure how to describe them anymore, but I've presented S&O in some pretty strange places, but I think this is right up there. And who doesn't love rural internet and the ability to escape from your kids and try and get the best signal? So with that, I might just leap straight into it. If you sort of flick onto the next one, Libby, I've kind of got a bit of a pictorial here of COVID-19 in 3 easy steps, or several easy steps. Of course, it's dripping with irony because there's no easy steps at the moment, and it's not even a sequential process. But let's sort of tackle in anyway from a dairy perspective. The whole thing really started, as most people would know, in China, and from the initial market impacts we saw were really around that food service space. So significant disruption to food service in China, which brought into wider industry disruption as, you know, Wuhan in particular, but other cities and broader provinces were locked down. That sort of bled into the logistics space as much as it did dairy production. So the main dairy impacts we saw were, you know, dropping consumption, and so a lot of local milk in China going into powder for a period of time. So they do have those sort of modest inventories there to deal with. But we also saw disruption logistically, and that's the first that a lot of Australian industry had to sort of face. It was, the threats to things like packaging, glyphosate. There's been a bit of conversation about, obviously, but just shipping too. So getting hold of refrigerator containers was a bit of a task not that long ago, because they were all piling up in Chinese ports, and there was no one there, moving them around and getting them off the port. So that caused a bit of a global headache. Of course, in the context we've had since, it probably wasn't much of a headache, but at the time it was just a bit of a pain in the neck. Now, with all of this going on, and as things have spread, the first impact on markets was Chinese buyers pulling back. And if you look down to the whole milk powder price there, I've just grabbed the GDT results, not including the latest price. As you can see, we had a bit of a good thing going there with prices picking up early in the new year. New Zealand advertising their latest dry conditions, and so we had some real constraint around supply there that had pushed things along again. Of course, Chinese buyers pull out, and you can see what happens to prices. Initially, we saw Southeast Asian buyers coming back in. They tend to sort of hover around and weigh in a bit more when prices do come off, and that's the sort of leveling out you can see there. And then, of course, it's become quite apparent recently that Southeast Asia's in for it, probably worse than China. So those buyers again have pulled back out. The event we saw this week was another sort of leveling off again as we saw Chinese buyers getting back in. The real unknown there is, or the likelihood is, that they're sort of just topping up. They've been quiet for a while, buying hand to mouth. They'll have to, people have still got to eat. They still need product, but I'd certainly be surprised if we saw a sustained recovery there. Certainly hope I'm wrong. But the upshot of all this is, of course, now we're heading down to the big R word. We've got a widespread global recession. We've got government debt that's going to places most of us alive have never seen it before, and that's going to weigh on the economy. Not to mention all the food service people now, across every major economy, or most major economies, that are out of work and don't have an income and aren't sort of producing anything. So not just food service, but anything that's non-essential, if you will, or of course involves gathering of people. So the long and the short of it is that we're in a completely unprecedented time in terms of the combination of circumstances. We've seen some of these things before, but we haven't seen them all together. So the outlook, of course, is anyone's guess, but we do know that recession is bad for business. Recession is especially bad for high value business, and probably the major impact on dairy is going to be that reduction in spending power, and people deciding to give up the 6-a-day iced coffee habit, or the single serve yogurts. The kind of value add products will be the ones that get cut out. Fortunately, the dairy industry isn't quite like the cruise ship industry. We are an essential service. People do need to eat. There will be a retreat to staple products, and so the product will continue to move. It's just a matter of what form it's in. I'll talk a little bit about that in Australian context in a few moments. So if we just flick to the next one, Libby. So in terms of the global market, I've sort of cut the slides down a bit here so that we don't have too many to flick through. But the real story heading into this into this calendar year, and really coming out of the last year, was that global milk supply had really been constrained, which was a fantastic thing for prices. It's why we've seen such a steady period of reasonably good commodity prices over the past sort of year or 18 months. Heading into this season, market fundamentals were still very good. Demand was solid. Supply was not overwhelming by any stretch. But as you can see at the very end of that chart, we had started to see a pickup in the northern hemisphere, so northwestern Europe, the US, and so things were starting to supply was starting to grow a bit. The key factor there being that they continued to have good milk prices, just like we have, but the weather had turned in their favour, and so we saw this production response getting underway as some of the restrictions that farmers had faced around weather were starting to dissipate. Now that's important not just from a market balance perspective, but it's important because it's part of what we're seeing at the moment with some of the images of milk dumping in particular that are doing the rounds. Dumping of milk is, it's not a good look, but probably one thing I'd like to say about that is that in the US, and particularly in the Northeast, it's a lot more commonplace than what it is here. I mean, it takes bushfires to unprecedented bushfires to cause that sort of thing to happen here. But in the Northeast there, where they've got a lot of fresh production capacity, they don't have a huge amount of surge capacity. They don't have a huge amount of milk powder capacity and ability to absorb that extra milk. They're coming into they're right in the middle of their spring flush at the moment. So seasonal peak in milk production, renewed growth in milk production, and coming off the better part of 10 years of growth. Now that growth certainly slowed down in recent times and went a little bit backwards, but the story for US dairy and European dairy for the large part has been growth over the past decade. So production capacity is tested at the best of times, and especially in the Northeast where there's a huge focus on those fresh products, liquid milk, which consumption of which is sort of tanking again on an annual basis in the US. Dumping milk is something they do. It's a supply chain management tool that they use, much the same as flaring natural gas. I'm personally not too stressed about it. It's not a good look when you've got empty supermarket shelves and you're dumping milk, and certainly that's pointing to some of the bottlenecks that are there in converting production from servicing the food service market to purely retail. We certainly heard some cheese plants are struggling to get staff in parts of the US, but on the whole, I'd certainly prefer they tip the milk down the drain and they turn it into some cheap subsidised powder and dump it somewhere where we're trying to sell something. But I guess the biggest takeaway from it is that it's just a sign of the disruption that's happened to food service markets in particular, and that's kind of the symptom, that the world's turned a bit crap rather than dumping milk itself being an issue. I think just one more comment about intervention. So we've heard about the milk dumping. There's a lot of commentary in the US and Europe. A lot of people going to the government with their hands out, as they tend to do in that part of the world when things turn pear-shaped. That's probably worth watching because the nature of the intervention that takes place will form a huge part of the outlook going forward. So, for example, if some of these schemes get up to pay farmers to produce less milk and deal with oversupply that way, that's the US taxpayer bailing us all out there, or the European taxpayer. So certainly a different proposition to it. For example, the Europeans reopen intervention buying and stack a whole heap of milk powder in storage that we've only just got rid of the last lot that they built up through their last market downturn. So I think there's going to be a lot of pushback on doing that. I think there's a lot of people in the European Commission that probably still have nightmares about stored milk powder, and I'm certainly happy to stoke those because we would prefer that if they're going to intervene, they don't do it in a way that screws the market up for the rest of us. So if we move to the next slide now, I might just change tack a little bit. It was kind of going well here. We entered 2020, and I think that some of the last commentary I saw in 2019 was that we were going to be out of hay by March. And whilst hay and grain is certainly still right up there in pricing terms, that commentary has really gone away. We've had some pretty decent rain, right through summer in parts of Gippsland here, where we've had 9 months of spring for some, but even in those heavily drought affected areas, I think there's most people have got a bit of a green pick or some moisture in the soil, and the cropping guys certainly look like they're getting out there and getting amongst it. So good outlook for rain, good signs for the grain crop. We've certainly heard, and there's been a bit of commentary in recent days about how the exchange rate is mucking with grain prices a bit. That is going to happen. But given the amount of seed going into the ground, if the outlook remains the way it is, we would certainly hope to see grain prices coming off a bit. And on the exchange rate, I mean, that's messing up importers of dairy as well. So it's kind of the dollar giveth and the dollar taketh away. But feed is very expensive. We certainly recognise that, but the signs around the weather and around the direction for those inputs are a hell of a lot better than what they were not that long ago. So we'll just click to the next one and covering off on milk production there. We had, as a result, partly of good farm gate prices, but partly as a result of the rainfall, we had seen a bit of a turnaround gathering steam. For the second half of this season, we'd always expected a bit of a turnaround just on the basis of the comparables, last year being weaker. But it got going a bit earlier. December and January numbers were better than I'd expected. And, since then we've got February out there, and even once you adjust for the leap year, the February numbers are pretty handy. And, March, some people saying that autumn's been drier than summer in places, but nonetheless, the trend is still looking pretty reasonable. From a whole of Australia perspective, we're expecting to end up somewhere between 3 and 5% was the forecast. We're much closer to 3% now, and I think in a year-to-date number as of the February numbers coming out is actually 2.6% down. So it would take a bit of a renewed deterioration to push us back to the wrong end of that range. But huge turnaround from probably November when I was giving some serious thought to revising that downwards. So there's a lot more milk out there than what we'd expected. Again, if it needs to be said, we're not in a position where that milk's going to have to be tipped down the drain. There's certainly plenty of homes for it at the moment, and any of you guys that are trading milk or in the either working for one of these aggregators or brokers or just trading at ex-farm gate will know it's been a bit of a job lately. But from what we're hearing, there's certainly a home for the milk at the moment, and that's not likely to change. If we just through to the next slide there, I'll just address the domestic market, and some of these insights are relevant to consumer markets in other countries. But one thing we had really going well in Australia was this value add story, and you can see from the chart on the right there that value growth was well in excess of volume growth for pretty much all major dairy categories. Average unit prices were going up. We're extracting more money per litre, and like all good things, that one came to an end pretty quickly. The turmoil that we've seen recently has been, obviously unrepresentative and won't be representative of what we see continuing. But in terms of the numbers, I think UHT sales went up, 90% over a 4-week period to the end of March. Cheese, fresh milk, heading up by similar numbers. A huge increase in households buying UHT milk, as you can imagine. People stocking up and people going back to dairy, which is obviously a heartening thing. That photo on the left there is just my local Bunya supermarket, but you all could have taken the same photo at some point if not still available to. The point about that, I guess, is that dairy doesn't come out of these things looking too bad. I mean, consumers are going to feel pretty poor in the next few months, potentially the next few years or longer, depending on how pessimistic you are about the economy. But dairy is, of course, core food, and again, as you can see from the photo, when you're looking down the barrel of a crisis, nobody wants to be mucking around with the plant juice. So back to basics is going to take a fair bit of money out in terms of people buying products to cook at home, buying the staples rather than maybe lashing out on some of the more expensive stuff, and the top end food service will certainly be feeling the pinch even once they're allowed to open up again. But we are a staple product. People will continue to buy it. Cooking at home has certainly been very good for butter prices and butter sales in the past. We're just going to have to watch how that goes in terms of the net effect, but there will be pressure on unit values, but certainly sales, we see sales tracking along pretty well in the medium term. The other thing to note about the plant juice is that it tends to sell at an obscenely high unit price as well. So we will probably, imagine that some of the social vegans out there might be reconsidering their options too if they're feeling poor. So that's their kind of Achilles heel in a time like this. And most households who buy plant-based beverages buy dairy as well. There's only about 7% that will purely buy the plant juice. And again, that's part of the picture you're seeing in that photo is that when you're panic buying, you're probably not going to be as tolerant of your teenager who's going through the vegan phase. So silver linings and everything, but I think there'll definitely be unit value pressure in the dairy market going forward. If we just go to the last slide there, I've sort of made it short and sweet here, so happy to take any number of questions. But the key takeaways are that we were actually enjoying a pretty decent set of conditions before all this came along. There's not just a nostalgic element to that, but it has set us up better than what we could have been. I'd certainly shudder to think what would have happened if we'd come into this situation with European milk production growing by 5%, or the sort of seasonal outlook that we had in November. We've got a little bit of a few things going our way, although certainly I'm sure most farmers would like to have had a bit more of a buffer up their sleeve, in terms of a quiet time before all this broke loose. But the outlook does offer some hope from that point of view. And the competition for milk, I mean, that hasn't gone away. There's still business to be done here, and there's still markets to build. And I certainly haven't seen anything suggesting that processors don't want anybody's milk anymore. So that's still going to be an element heading into the new season, even though there is a heck of a lot of storm clouds on the horizon from a market perspective. But on that note, we are entering an unknown set of circumstances. Milk supply has been on the rise, so the trajectory is there. Whether that's turned around by governments overseas paying farmers to dump the milk, or whether it is encouraged by governments overseas paying farmers for being top blokes is a big question, and that's going to influence whether that's kind of shut down early or not. Demand is certainly likely to ease, especially in the short term, where there will be disruption. But that in the longer term, it's going to come down to the economic outlook. We know that there's a huge correlation between dairy trade and just GDP as a simple measure. Economic health leads to dairy consumption in our major dairy markets. And that's probably about the size of it. In terms of farm gate price, which of course everybody wants to know. It's a brave person who takes a stab at that at this point, and I do think back to where I was 3 months ago and what I would have thought about the state of the world, and then 3 months ahead to the start of the season is a terrifying prospect. But we've seen predictions out there for southern regions of anywhere between the high fives and the low sevens, and if I was looking to provide something approaching helpful advice to anyone out there, looking to build a business around this, it'd be definitely, this is the time to be setting yourself up with a set of scenarios and a set of plans, because, it's, to be honest, no one knows exactly where we're going to be in 3 months' time. And it's one of those things where you want to be able to pull a plan off the shelf and put it into action, rather than being shocked and disappointed because your favourite pundit got it wrong. So I would that's kind of my confession there. I don't know what the price is going to be, but at this point that's the range, and I've seen credible analysis at both ends of it. So for my part, I'm probably pegging it right in the middle. That's all I've got on the slides. I imagine there's a few questions that have come through. I'm happy to chat through any of those. I'll do the chatting, and you can hopefully get something useful out of it.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that. It's always good to hear your update. So from where you're sitting in the tractor at the moment, question has come through of how will the flow of products such as glyphosate be impacted, do you think? It's
the day for making brave statements, but my feeling is that we've probably seen the worst of that. Certainly what all the major producers of those products are saying is that their facilities are open and operating. We're seeing logistics in places like China get going again, and everyone's trying to fill orders. The point that was made in our kind of the information we've had from those producers is that there's been a huge seasonal element to it as well here in Australia. Again, that turnaround in the weather outlook prompted a lot of people to go and ramp up their plans a lot quicker than what they'd expected. But I think there's product on the water. It should be arriving. I'd be surprised if we sort of descend into a worse situation with those kinds of products. The caveat there is probably anything that's sourced out of Europe. I think Europe's obviously going through a hell of a time at the moment, and if you've got something that's coming out of Europe, you're probably going to have some headaches. But things like glyphosate, most fertilizers, those kinds of things, I would imagine that's going to normalise a bit.
Thanks. Question through from Nick Reed. Any indicators on how long China's reserve dairy food stock is likely to last?
No, the short answer is no. We think they've probably got, they've got powder stockpiles or a powder stockpile to work through. It's at best sort of 3 months worth of production, but of course, China's been eating its way through this self-isolation process as well. So I don't see a huge stock situation in China at the moment. It's a modest powder stock situation, but I think the bigger issue is the economic outlook, and at the moment it kind of looks like China's going to get away with it. But if we see things continue to deteriorate in most of their major customer markets, in Europe and in the US, their economy might start to turn down again, and that's when we'll see some real headaches there, I think. But stockpiles, I don't think are a huge situation at the moment.
On the subject of China, how did monthly dairy importations into China change over the last 4 months as they've gone through the COVID issues?
So the data's always lagged for that. So I probably don't have most of the relevant period actually, and the rest of it is, especially January, is influenced by the seasonal build up in stocks. So you see these massive increase in shipments through December and into January, trying to beat the low tariff window. So at that point in time, there was quite a bit of the pipeline to fill in China, and there was a fair bit of demand to get product in ahead of the tariff window closing. And I don't think that would have been any different to say a year ago. I think it'll be the numbers that start to come out in the next few weeks and months that'll be the indicator there, because the product that's not been bought by and exported to China will be starting to not arrive now. So it's probably one to keep an eye on.
Excellent, thanks. Any idea on how many dairy operations have been lost in Northern Vic through high water prices and sales to a couple of major operators buying dairy farms for conversion to beef and horticulture?
That's probably a better one to ask someone a bit more locally, but we know there's been quite a number of exits in that region, and quite a number of sales under the circumstances there. So there's been a big number of exits in Northern Victoria. I couldn't put the number on it right here, but more than one or two. It's definitely it's something. It's not just one or two farms going out to those consortiums, and especially as anyone locally know, the ones with the deep lead aquifer access are actually in pretty high demand.
Yeah. Okay. And a question from Matthew: does DA have any data on milk sold in Australia in terms of what percentage of milk produced is sold through food service versus retail versus export?
Yes, we do. There's about 25% of our milk goes into the liquid market in one form or another. Off the top of my head, about 1.4 billion litres of that goes through goes through retail channels in some form or another. And so I've done 25% of a number and then given you an absolute to go with that. So I'll try and do the mental arithmetics, but I think it's about 2 billion litres in total, 1.4 through some form of retail, the balance through food service, except for, a relatively small amount, which is exported. Certainly growing amount, but relatively small in the scheme of things.
Yeah, cool. Question from Will Ryan down here in Gippy. Calving's just around the corner for a lot of farmers, and this requires greater input from overseas and seasonal workers. Is there any insight for travel restrictions lifting or advice for farmers looking for these types of workers in the next coming months?
That might be one for JP. I mean, from my perspective, I'm sure as hell happy I don't have any overseas trips booked, and my in-laws can't make it in for the next couple of probably years. No, I think I'll hand that one to JP, but I don't certainly have any indication that they're going to be lifted anytime soon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Libby. Thanks, John. There is advice sitting on the website, which was only posted 2 days ago, I think, that covers off on people who are working on farms right now who are under some sort of visa arrangement, whether they be backpackers or otherwise. But they're people that are already situated in Australia and potentially already on farm. I can't offer any insight or advice as to what's going to happen with restrictions for people coming in from other countries, specifically New Zealand, I suppose, or parts of Southeast Asia. So we don't have any insight as to how those restrictions might change. But certainly for people who are currently in Australia under visas, the advice is there and it's accessible under the tab that is for information for employers, which is part of the COVID-19 pages.
Excellent, thanks, John. And John, just wanted to come back to one other question that we wanted to revisit in regards to disinfection. Could you just expand on what actually is available on the website in regards to disinfection?
Yeah, thanks for that, Libby. And this is with regard to a comment that was put through on the chat just before. There is a standalone fact sheet that's available specifically around disinfection or sanitisation product use that's sitting in the COVID pages. And one of the things that it really highlights is that irrespective of what sanitisation chemical is used, cleaning the surface properly first to get rid of organic material especially is important prior to putting the sanitisation or the disinfectant product on first. And I should have, it was my mistake in not highlighting that before. So it really is a two-step process, proper cleaning first to remove organic matter, for example, and then applying the disinfectant to the surface. If the cleaning does not take place, then the effectiveness of the disinfectant or sanitisation solution is severely compromised. So that was an important clarification point, and thank you very much to the person who raised that in the chat.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So big thanks today to John Droppert in the tractor and to John Penry based out of his home for today's presentation. We've had some really great questions come through, and I appreciate everyone taking the time out to hook into the webinar today. It's the first one that we've done like this for a while, and I see that we've got about 220 people in for it today, which is really good. I hope that the insight that John and John have given you will give you some ideas to be able to assist the farmers that you're working with, and that we know that as service providers, you're coming in contact with so many farmers each day, and it's really important that we can assist you to keep that message consistent and get that and be able to help them in any way possible. Today's session will be available as a recording early next week, but if you need any more information, feel free to reach out to anyone in the regional development program. So we've got Gipps Dairy, Murray Dairy or West Vic Dairy, or just head to the Dairy Australia website where we've got all the info that you saw before is sitting there ready to go. So thank you all very much for your time this morning. Have a great Easter break have a long weekend, and I'm sure we'll see you all in our circles. Thanks. See you, everyone.